In today's video, we're going to talk about putting super single tires on my Prevost and the pros and cons of doing this on your bus or RV. If you like watching my videos for wrenching content, I'm going to tell you right now this doesn't have a whole lot of it, and I'm sorry about that. Most of the time when I'm doing something, I try to make a video about it. This was one of those situations where I wasn't able to. During the course of our trip over Christmas, I'd noticed that it seemed like one of the drive tires, specifically the outer drive tire on the passenger side, had a slow leak. It was a very slow leak. It only leaked down about 10 psi over the course of the entire trip, and I thought that it might just have to do with a valve stem that wasn't seating entirely correctly, or else maybe just the tire bead hadn't seated perfectly well on the rim itself. But then about 2 days before we were getting ready to leave on our spring break trip, I found that there was a nail that had gone into the tread of the tire, but right towards the outside, and had gone into the sidewall. This was something that wasn't going to be pluggable, and I realized I was going to have to do something before we left on our trip. Overall, the drive tires were in decent condition, but they were about 4 years old. They did have a number of miles on them. I'm not sure how many, but they were worn, and I knew that I wanted to do a super single conversion on this bus. If you followed my channel for a while, you might remember that I put super singles on my previous RV. If you have a tire dolly, that would be smarter. And that was actually the last modification that I did to it before selling it, and so I didn't get to reap the benefits. But from the test drive that I did on it, it was very clear to me that I liked the improvement from the super singles overall, and I knew that I wanted to do that on the Prevost. Since I had a limited amount of time and I needed to just kind of get this ready so we could get going on our spring break trip without any delay, I just had to get this done, and unfortunately wasn't able to record any video on it. From when I'd done the super single conversion on my previous bus, I'd amassed a collection of wheels, and so fortunately I had a pair of super single wheels that I was able to use, and my local truck tire shop had a couple of super singles in the correct size that I needed. In my previous video on this, I talk about some of the measurements that I did on the previous bus and how I went about figuring out whether or not this was going to fit on it. For this, I really wasn't worried about that because, for one, I'd learned enough from the previous video to know that these were going to fit just fine, and also the wheels that I had to work with were a zero offset wheel. So what that means is that whatever your width of the tire is going to be, it's not offset one direction or the other, it's just going to be centered. The standard duals, we've got the zero offset super singles, and then we've got the 2-inch outset super singles. Well, a super single in this case is going to be a tire 455, 55, 22 and a half. The diameter of that is going to be about the same as the 315s that were on this bus previously, and the width is going to be significantly narrower because instead of having two 315 tires, you're going to have a single 455, so just that basic math, 455 is a lot less than 630. So I knew that it wasn't going to rub and that I was going to be safe just mounting tires on this and then putting them on. So now backing up for a second, what are super singles? Most trucks and buses on the drive axle have two wheels on either side, and the idea behind a super single is that you've got one large, wider tire on one single rim that replaces those two wheels and those two tires. There are a lot of benefits on paper that go with this. The first and biggest one that gets advertised is a reduced rolling resistance, which means that you're going to get better fuel economy. Most RV owners aren't going to be affected by a fuel economy improvement that much, but if you've got a tour bus or you've got a semi-truck that logs many, many miles, then you are probably going to notice that. Another benefit of super singles is that they significantly reduce the weight, and especially the unsprung weight, of your bus. What's nice about reducing unsprung weight is that that's going to improve your ride and handling, because that means that your suspension can more easily move up and down, because whenever you have some kind of an impact from the road, then you have less weight that has to get moved with that force, and the suspension is therefore able to be more compliant, move easier, and you're going to notice that in a better ride. You're also going to get a better ride because super singles have a larger bubble of air and only two sidewalls as opposed to four sidewalls and two smaller bubbles of air. So the tires themselves are going to be able to more easily absorb impacts, even though you are typically going to be running at a higher air pressure. One other thing that I was looking for with super singles, and there's a bit of debate about this, whether this is going to be an improvement or not, is that a super single having a wider single patch tire versus two smaller patches should in theory do better in an off-road situation. When you've got two smaller patches, what's going to tend to happen is that each one of those is going to be more able to dig a rut into the ground underneath you, versus a single tire that, even though it is a narrower width, should in theory be able to have a better traction surface and not dig a rut into the ground. A Prevost is not an off-road vehicle, and so you got to be careful with where you take one of these anyway. But the nature of RVing means that you are going to end up with places that are dirt or grass, basically areas that aren't paved. So for me, I'm going to go with the theory that these are a benefit. If you take a look on any modern military vehicle that is heavy and off-road, they're all running a military equivalent of a super single tire. Look at something like an HEMTT or an HET. They run multiple axles of really big, wide single tires as opposed to dual. So that tells me that the military thinks it's better. Cost-wise, personally, I find that it's going to be a bit of a wash. Yes, a super single tire is going to be pretty expensive, but if you compare it to the price of two equivalent tires that you would put on with dual wheels, then you're not going to end up with all that much of a difference. Buying the super single wheels are an added expense, but those are available used for reasonable prices, and there's not really a need to buy new unless you really want to. For me, there was one other important thing that was driving me towards a super single conversion on my Prevost, and that had to do with the lug nuts on the drive axle. If you paid close attention in some of my previous videos, you may have noticed that with the lug nuts torqued down, they actually were protruding outside of the studs by just a little bit. This was something that I never made mention of specifically because it wasn't something that I wanted anyone to think was okay. You never want to have your lug nuts or any nuts in general protruding outside of whatever stud, bolt, or anything that they're attaching to. You want to have at least a couple of threads protruding outside of the nut itself. The reason why I was having this issue on my bus is because at some point in the bus's history, somebody had changed the inner rear wheels from steel to aluminum. Now by itself, that's a good conversion. Going from a steel wheel to an aluminum is going to reduce the weight and therefore reduce the unsprung weight. But the problem that you're going to run into with that is not with the wheels themselves, it's going to be with the wheel studs that are going into the hub. When you have an aluminum wheel versus a steel wheel, the aluminum wheel is going to be wider because aluminum is a weaker material, and so you need to make a wider wheel to have the same weight capacity. That wheel is still going to be lighter weight than the steel wheel despite having more material because aluminum is so much lighter. But in order to do that conversion properly, you need to install longer wheel studs. And this is something that happens on a lot of buses, and it's very rare that people actually install the correct longer wheel studs. It can become a safety concern, and you need to correct it one way or another, whether you're installing new wheel studs or if you're doing something like either converting back to steel wheels or installing super singles. A super single aluminum wheel is roughly the same width versus a single aluminum wheel, so by converting to super singles, I was going to gain a whole lot more thread engagement, and I'll show you here. So here you can see with the lug nuts tightened down, they've got lots of threads sticking out here. Before, when I had the two aluminum wheels on, the lug nuts were all the way out here, and then actually even a little bit past. There were about one or two threads that a stud was not going through the lug nuts on, and that's definitely not what you want. So for me, converting to super singles wasn't just about the benefits I talked about previously, it was also about correcting a problem that I needed to fix. So now, what are some of the negatives of super singles, and what are some of the things that you need to consider if you think you might want to make this conversion? So when people talk about cons with respect to super singles, pretty much all of them have to do around the prospect of a tire failure. Now, tires failing are a big deal on any vehicle. They're especially a big deal if you're talking about a bus, truck, semi, something that's got big tires that are heavy, that are holding a whole lot of weight and have a high air pressure in them. So one comment that was made is that when super singles fail, they tend to fail in a more spectacular manner and that they can cause more damage to the bus when that happens. Another comment that's commonly made is that if a super single fails, you're stuck where you are and you're not going to be able to limp to another exit, where if you had duals, you might be able to accomplish that. An additional point is that if you need to get your tire replaced on the road, there are fewer options for super singles, and you might have a harder time finding a tire shop that has the super singles that you want in the size that you want in stock. I ran into that issue a little bit when I did this conversion because I needed to get tires quickly, and I ended up having to go with what the tire shop had in stock. I'd wanted to go with the Michelin super single tire. Michelin's generally considered to be the best when it comes to super singles, and I ended up with this Bridgestone Graytec M853 instead. Overall though, I've been happy with the tires, so this hasn't been too big of a deal. Now, if you think about those negatives, they really are all based around one thing, and that's the idea of the tire failing. In all my years and miles of driving, I've had exceedingly few tire failures. It's really something that I just don't worry about very much. I got a very interesting comment from one person who'd had experience with a whole fleet of Prevosts that were all running super singles, and he said that in about 10 million miles of driving over the course of 50 buses that they had a grand total of 3 failures of the super singles. 2 of them had to do with driver error with hitting the tire on something in a parking lot, and then the third one had to do with some debris on the road, which that can happen. But because they were also running a tire pressure monitor system, the driver was alerted to the impending failure and was able to get off of the highway before there was a catastrophic failure. From my perspective, 3 failures over the course of 10 million miles are pretty good odds, especially when 2 of them were driver inflicted. Prevost agrees, and they actually offer super singles on the buses right from the factory. One thing that's important to note, though, is that when Prevost sells a bus from the factory with super singles, they have a slightly wider axle to push those wheels further out towards the edge while still having a 0 outset wheel. And that brings up another point that we should discuss, is a 0 offset wheel versus what's called the 2-inch outset wheel that pushes the tires out an additional 2 inches. The 0 offset wheel is going to be considered better from a bearing longevity perspective because with the outset wheel, you're going to be putting a twisting force, especially on that outer wheel bearing. The 0 offset wheels are going to be distributing that load evenly on the bearings. The one thing I'm not entirely happy about is the fact that I do have the wheels about the 2 inches inboard. I don't like the aesthetics that go with that, but from a durability perspective on the bearings, it probably is the right thing to do, so I'm not too upset about it. You might have also noticed that I've got these flow below wheel covers on. These were a relatively recent addition, and I put them on after the super singles. I was going to put them on anyway, but especially having the 0 offset wheels and having these tires in a little bit further than I wanted, these wheel covers do a good job of helping make the aesthetic look like the tires are a little bit further out, so that helps with that. As with any tire that you're going to be putting on a bus, one of the biggest things that you need to be concerned with is making sure that the tire matches the weight rating that you need for that axle. In my case, these tires are rated for 11,700 pounds each, and this drive axle is rated for 22,500 pounds. So these tires fit the axle just fine. I got a few comments from people who seem to think that you should have tires that are at a much, much higher weight rating than what the axle is rated for, especially because you've got a lifting tag axle. That's fine if you want to do it, and it certainly isn't going to hurt anything, but I disagree with that philosophy. It is true that when you lift the tag axle, you are going to be putting more weight on the drive axle, but also think about what you're using that for a minute. The reason why you lift the tag axle is to get a tighter turning radius when you're doing a very tight maneuver. The lifting tag axle on a Prevost is not like a lifting tag axle on a semi-truck where you're raising it when you don't need that extra weight capacity and then you're lowering it when you've got a really heavy load and you need that weight capacity. The default for the tag axle is down, and in fact, when you lift the tag axle, you get a light on the dashboard and the bus beeps at you to remind you, hey, this is an abnormal condition. That very low speed, very short duration of having that little bit of extra weight is just fine. That's not going to hurt anything. But one thing that you do need to make sure of is that the tires that you are putting on are going to be sufficient for the rated weight of the axle. From my understanding, there are some Prevosts, especially later buses, where they've increased that weight rating. And so before you consider doing a super single conversion, make sure that the weight rating of the tires is going to be within the weight rating of the axle. You definitely don't want tires that are rated less than what the axle is rated for. Another thing, if you're considering a super single conversion, is to make sure that you have the correct wheels for the application. My bus has what's considered to be a hub pilot wheel, where the center opening of the wheel is what is ultimately fit fairly tightly against the hub, and that's what holds the weight. Here you can see a hub pilot wheel, and the distinctive features on it are that you've got a little taper here, and then you got another one on the other side because the wheels are reversible and you can have them be inward or outward facing. But this taper fits snugly around the hub, and you can see that at the lug nut holes, these are flush. So when you tighten down the lug nuts, they are pushing against the wheel here, which is holding the wheel to the vehicle. However, the weight is being carried here on the hub. When you've got stud pilot or bud wheels, it's the opposite. This part here in the center, it doesn't have a taper, it's got a looser fit, but you've got the tapers here in the holes for where the wheel studs go. And then when you tighten down the lug nuts, those are going to then fit into these tapered holes, and then those are going to carry the weight. You can see here where the weight is being actually put through the hub to the wheel and the hub pilot wheel. I had mostly associated stud pilot wheels with older buses, but apparently there are actually a number of newer Prevosts that still have this as well. So before you do this conversion, make sure that you have bought or can buy the correct type of wheels for the application. So I've put about 5,000 miles on my Prevost since doing the super single conversion, and I'm a really big fan of how they ride. My wife's comment was that she didn't think it was possible for the Prevost to ride any better, and here it does. I noticed several things. The first thing is that the bus is absolutely smoother, especially going over bumps, but it's just smoother driving down the road in general. These super singles, believe it or not, actually seem quieter than the dual wheels that I had on there before, although that might just have to do with the age of the tires. It could be that they were just getting noisy, being a few years old. One negative comment that I've seen truckers make is that super singles don't work as well in snow and ice conditions. I can't comment on that very heavily, but we did end up driving in a bit of snow and slush, and I didn't notice any adverse effects with the super singles. One of the things that I think plays into that a bit is which kind of super single you get. Since one of the biggest benefits of super singles is supposed to be lower rolling resistance for improved fuel economy, a lot of super single tires are designed with a tread pattern that is based around minimum rolling resistance. These are considered to be a severe service tire that actually have some tread blocks in them and are designed for conditions other than just a straight dry pavement. So if you're doing a super single conversion and you're concerned about that, I would suggest that you take a look at the different options out there and pick your tire based off of the traction needs that you expect to have, not just based off of the lowest rolling resistance and cost. Have I found any negatives with super singles on this? No, I really haven't. I understand the perspectives for some reasons why people might want to avoid super singles, but for me, I personally think that these are the way to go. Probably the one piece of advice that I would give if you're considering super singles is to make sure that you have a tire pressure monitor so that if you do have a tire go out or that is going out, you're going to notice that sooner. Regardless of whether or not you run super singles, I strongly recommend having a tire pressure monitor. I use a TST tire pressure monitor. I'll put a link to that in the description. Some would make the argument that you especially want to have them with super singles. My opinion is that it's something that you should be running anyway. You're probably not going to notice a tire getting low until it gets critically low and has a failure, but a tire pressure monitor is going to alert you to these things before they become a big problem. As an example, last summer we were on an RV trip towing my enclosed trailer, and the tire pressure monitor told me that one of the tires was getting low. We were able to get off the highway and get into a Walmart parking lot where they were able to fix the thing before having a tire explode and cause a much bigger amount of damage and a much higher cost. As with any tire, another thing that you need to do is make sure that you match the tire pressure to the weight of your axle. The best way to do this is going to be to weigh your bus so that you know exactly how much weight is on each axle, and I'm going to cover that in a future video. But in absence of that, you can go with what the rating is of the axle and set your tire pressure accordingly. Tire manufacturers publish charts that show the relationship between weight on the tire and tire pressure that you should use, so this is actually a pretty easy operation. I hope you found this video useful and interesting. Super singles are not a technology that's new these days. I personally think that they're a really good tire option, especially for an RV where comfort is one of the things that you're concerned about going down the road. But the stability hasn't been negatively impacted, the traction hasn't been negatively impacted. I like the aesthetics, I like the reduced weight, and especially if you've got a setup where you have two aluminum wheels and your studs are not the correct length, this is actually a pretty easy option to correct that. Leave any questions down below in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.